the first night in Wilson Hall didn't exactly feel welcoming. I hadn't expected anything luxurious. I knew this was an old building, steeped in history, practically a relic on campus. But when I walked in, the draft hit me first, cold enough to make the hair on my arms stand up. I chalked it up to poor insulation and the place's age. Wilson Hall had been around since the early 1900s, after all. I dropped my bags on the floor, the sound echoing in the silence. It was late, and the hallway stretched ahead of me, lined with door after door, most closed, each identical, painted a dingy off-white that somehow seemed tired, as if the building itself was exhausted. I found my room about halfway down, room 217, and pushed open the door, stepping into a space barely big enough to fit a twin bed, a desk, and a wardrobe. The room smelled faintly of old paper and dust, like it hadn't been lived in for years, though I knew I was far from the first student assigned to this room. As I started unpacking, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I told myself it was just nerves. I'd never lived alone before. And Wilson Hall, with its peeling paint and flickering lights, would make anyone uneasy. But the feeling grew, gnawing at the back of my mind as I tried to settle in. It was maybe an hour later, as I lay on my bed staring up at the ceiling, that I heard it. A creak from the hallway, followed by a soft thud. I froze, listening, and then it came again. Another creak, then the unmistakable sound of a door opening, and then closing. I sat up, my heart beating a little faster, and strained to hear. I told myself it was just another student moving around, maybe someone arriving late, but the sounds continued, door after door creaking open, only to close again seconds later, as if someone were checking each room. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I pulled on my shoes, crept to the door, and cracked it open just enough to peek out. The hallway was empty, dimly lit by a single light near the stairwell. There was no one there. I waited, half expecting to see a shadow, to hear footsteps, but nothing happened. The creaks and thuds stopped as suddenly as they had begun. Trying to shake off the unease, I closed my door again, locked it, and lay back down. But sleep wouldn't come. The silence stretched on, heavy and thick, almost pressing down on me. Then, just as I was drifting off, I heard something else. It was a scraping sound, low and rhythmic, coming from the wall beside me. I frowned, pressing my ear to the cool plaster. The sound was unmistakable. Something was moving on the other side, scraping against the floor. Furniture, maybe. A chair being dragged across the floor, inch by inch. I remembered then that the room next to mine, 217's twin, room 218, was supposed to be empty. When I'd signed in earlier, the RA had mentioned that it hadn't been assigned to anyone for years. Some kind of maintenance issue, she'd said, though she hadn't elaborated. Yet here it was, the sounds of heavy furniture shifting in the supposedly empty room. Each scrape set my nerves on edge, filling me with a strange, cold dread that I couldn't quite explain. I don't know how long I sat there, listening, frozen with a mixture of curiosity and fear. Eventually, the scraping stopped, and silence fell once more. I told myself it was nothing, a draft or a loose pipe, maybe, or even just my mind playing tricks on me. But even as I tried to convince myself, I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that something was watching me. As I lay back down, I caught sight of the shadows in the corner of my room, flickering strangely in the faint light from the hallway. For a split second, it looked as though they were moving, stretching across the floor toward my bed. I blinked, and they were gone. But the feeling remained, lingering in the darkness, pressing in around me. That was my first night in Wilson Hall, and it was only the beginning. The next morning, I woke groggy and unsettled, still haunted by the sounds from the previous night. I'd told myself it was all in my head, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. By the time I'd showered and had coffee, curiosity had replaced my initial fear. I couldn't ignore the things I'd heard, and I needed answers. I spent most of the day in the campus library, sifting through old yearbooks, newspapers, and anything I could find about Wilson Hall. I'd hoped for a simple explanation. Maybe the place had a history of creaky floors, or the building had structural issues. Instead, what I found was far darker. The first discovery was in a dusty old yearbook from the 1950s, tucked away in a forgotten corner of the library. In a small section dedicated to Wilson Hall, I found a short paragraph mentioning that the dormitory had been built over what was once a cemetery. According to the note, most of the bodies had been relocated to a nearby graveyard in the 1920s, but there were rumors that some graves had been left undisturbed. It sent a chill through me to think that Wilson Hall, with all its quiet creaks and groans, might be resting on forgotten graves. And the thought that maybe someone had been left behind. But that was only the beginning. Digging deeper, I found a newspaper article from the 1970s detailing reports of strange events in Wilson Hall. Several students had reported strange, echoing footsteps in the halls late at night, cold spots in random areas, and even objects that seemed to move on their own. One student claimed he'd woken up to find his desk chair facing his bed, as if someone had been sitting there, watching him sleep. As I read, I couldn't shake the feeling that these stories felt familiar. Footsteps, moving furniture, that eerie feeling of being watched, these were the same things I'd experienced my first night. Each detail sent another shiver down my spine, but I kept going, poring over every line, every rumor. The stories stretched back decades, passed down by students who'd stayed in Wilson Hall and felt the same inexplicable presence lingering in the building. The next shock came from a student I ran into on campus later that afternoon. I'd been asking around casually, hoping for more recent stories about Wilson Hall, when a girl named Emily overheard me. She introduced herself, looking curious, and pulled me aside. "Wilson Hall?" she asked, glancing around as if she was worried someone would overhear. "You're staying there?" I nodded, trying to keep my tone light. "Yeah, just moved in." "You know anything about it?" She hesitated, then lowered her voice. "When I was a freshman, I stayed there too. Room 213. It was fine at first, but then I started noticing weird things. Sometimes I'd come back and find my textbooks on the floor, even though I was sure I'd left them on my desk. And there was this spot near the window that was always freezing cold, even in the middle of summer. It was like stepping into a different room entirely." I could feel my pulse quickening as she spoke, the hair on the back of my neck prickling. I wasn't alone. Other people had felt it too. She continued, "The worst part, though, was the scratching. Late at night, I'd hear this scratching sound in the walls. I thought it was mice or something, but it never sounded right. Almost like someone was trying to get out." She shuddered, clearly uncomfortable just remembering it. I left the conversation shaken. If Emily had experienced the same things I was dealing with, then it wasn't just my imagination. Wilson Hall really was hiding something. Over the next few days, I started asking more questions, talking to anyone who ever lived in the building. Most people brushed it off, but a few shared stories that were eerily similar to my own experiences. A guy named Kevin told me about the flickering lights and a mirror in his room that always seemed to tilt by itself. Another student, Sarah, claimed she'd seen a shadowy figure at the end of the hallway one night, standing perfectly still, watching her. By the time she worked up the nerve to approach, it had disappeared. The final shock came when I managed to track down one of the older campus maintenance staff members, an older man named Tom. He looked at me with a weary expression when I mentioned Wilson Hall, as if he'd been expecting this. "Look," he said, leaning in close, "you didn't hear this from me, but I've been working here for over 20 years, and I'll tell you now, Wilson Hall has a bad history. There's a reason that place is always having issues. Lights flickering, pipes banging, furniture moving, there's something off about it. I've had to go in more times than I can count to fix things that shouldn't even be broken." I nodded, feeling a strange mixture of dread and excitement. "Have you ever heard anything? Or seen anything?" Tom looked away, running a hand over his face. "One time, I was in there alone, middle of the night, trying to fix a leak in the third-floor bathroom. I was just finishing up when I heard footsteps, slow and steady, coming down the hall. But when I stepped out, there was no one there. Just empty all the way down." He hesitated, his eyes distant. "But that wasn't the worst of it. I swear, as I was leaving, I heard someone whisper my name. Clear as day, right in my ear. I felt a cold sweat prickling at my skin. Every story, every detail was like another piece of a puzzle I didn't want to solve. But I couldn't stop thinking about it, couldn't shake the feeling that all of this was connected. That somehow, I'd been brought to Wilson Hall for a reason. That night, as I lay in bed, every creak and groan of the building seemed louder, more menacing. I closed my eyes, but all I could think about were the empty graves, the decades of rumors, the scratching Emily had heard in the walls. And then, as if on cue, I heard it, the faint, rhythmic sound of furniture scraping against the floor, coming from room 218. I sat up, my pulse racing, and listened. The scraping grew louder, moving closer to the wall that separated our rooms. The air in my room felt thick, almost suffocating, and that feeling of being watched washed over me again, stronger than ever. Just when I thought I couldn't take it any longer, the sound stopped. Silence filled the room, heavy and oppressive. I was about to lie back down when I saw something out of the corner of my eye. My desk chair, the one I'd left neatly tucked under the desk, was now turned to face the bed, as if someone had been sitting there, watching me sleep. My blood ran cold. The chair hadn't moved on its own. It couldn't have. And yet there it was, unmistakably out of place. I barely slept that night, every nerve on edge, convinced that at any moment, something would step out of the shadows. Wilson Hall had secrets, that much was clear. And whatever was in this building, it wasn't done with me yet. The next few nights in Wilson Hall felt like an unending descent into madness. Every time I thought I'd get a moment's rest, something would happen. It started with the doors, swinging open and closed on their own, sometimes softly, other times with a loud creak that echoed through the hallway. One night, I got up to close my door, only to feel it resist, as if something on the other side was holding it in place. When I finally pushed it shut, the latch clicked with an unsettling finality, like a door being closed on a coffin. That wasn't the worst of it. Shadows started appearing in the mirrors, flickering, shifting figures that seemed to linger just behind my reflection. They didn't move like normal shadows, they pulsed, darkening and fading in rhythmic, almost hypnotic patterns. One night, I found myself standing before the mirror, watching as a dark figure formed over my shoulder, its shape vague but menacing, with an unnatural stillness that made my skin crawl. I whipped around, convinced I'd see someone, but there was nothing. Just the empty room, silent and watching. And then there were the dreams. I'd close my eyes only to find myself wandering through an old cemetery, the ground slick with mud, thick fog winding around cracked tombstones. In every dream, I'd see the same figure standing by a gravestone, a faceless silhouette draped in black, watching me with an intensity one could feel despite the lack of eyes. Each night, I'd get a little closer to it, feeling its presence pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't escape. I'd wake up gasping for breath, drenched in sweat, the image of that faceless figure etched into my mind as if it had been carved there by something much darker than a dream. It wasn't just me. Other residents began sharing stories, too. People whispered about seeing shadows darting down the hallways or feeling sudden, icy drafts in their rooms. One of my friends, Alex, mentioned that he'd come back to his room one night to find all his books scattered across the floor. When he'd bent down to pick them up, he'd noticed words scrawled across the pages, as if written in dark ink, "Leave now." Another student, Emma, confessed that she'd woken up in the middle of the night to find her bed facing a different direction. She swore she'd heard footsteps circling her room, followed by a low whispering that seemed to come from all around her. The entire dorm felt infected, as though whatever lingered here was feeding off our fear, growing stronger with each passing night. The air was thick and suffocating, like it held a weight that bore down on us, pressing into our lungs and filling us with dread. It felt like the walls themselves were closing in, like we were trapped in a place that was slowly, deliberately tearing at our sanity. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know if this was all in my head or if there really was something in Wilson Hall, watching, waiting. So, I decided to set up my phone to record overnight. I angled it towards the center of the room, ensuring that it captured both the door and my bed, and hit record. The tiny red light blinked on, a small assurance that I wasn't entirely alone. That night, I lay in bed, my heart pounding, wondering what, if anything, the camera might capture. When I woke the next morning, everything felt normal. No shadows, no creaking doors. For a moment, I dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, it had all been a bad dream. But when I reviewed the footage, any hope I'd held onto vanished. The video began normally enough, just the dim glow of my bedside lamp and the stillness of my room. But around 2:17 a.m., the door creaked open by itself, slowly, as if pushed by an unseen hand. A few seconds later, the temperature in the room seemed to drop on camera. I could see my breath fogging the air, something that hadn't happened to me at the time. Then, at 3:03 a.m., something darker appeared. The first thing I saw was the shadow. It slid into the room from the hallway, inching along the floor, rising and forming into a tall, dark figure near my bed. I watched, horrified, as it leaned over my sleeping form, its head tilting as if studying me, like some grotesque predator watching its prey. It lingered there for several minutes, its shape pulsating, shifting, as though struggling to hold its form. Then, as if sensing my subconscious awareness, it reached out, a dark, indistinct hand stretching toward my chest. The figure moved in slow, deliberate motions, reaching and retracting, as if hesitant or savoring the moment. And then, I saw its face, or rather, its lack of one. The figure leaned in close, and where a face should have been, there was only a smooth, dark void, an emptiness that seemed to absorb all light around it. I stared at the screen, transfixed and terrified, as I watched it hover above me, its faceless head almost grazing my skin. And then it did something that sent my heart into overdrive. It leaned down and whispered something in my ear. I couldn't make out the words on the recording, but the effect was clear. In the video, I shifted uncomfortably in my sleep, as though hearing something just at the edge of consciousness. But the worst came at 3:33 a.m., when the shadow's arm extended towards my desk, where I kept a small, framed photo of my grandmother. The figure touched the frame, and I saw the picture shake, just slightly, as if disturbed by a slight breeze. When the figure finally left, disappearing into the hallway, the room was still again. But the last few seconds of the recording revealed something chilling. The frame had been turned to face the wall. I could hardly breathe as I finished watching the video. It was clear that this wasn't just some random haunting. Whoever, or whatever, was in Wilson Hall had a purpose. And it knew about me, about my family, about things it had no right to know. I started piecing together what I'd learned. The cemetery, the figure in my dreams, the intense focus on me and the other residents, it felt personal, calculated. Almost like it was reaching out to us, pulling us into its world. And that's when I remembered something I'd read in one of the old campus newspapers. Wilson Hall had been built on a section of the cemetery that was said to be reserved for those who were lost or unclaimed. There was mention of a nameless figure, a vagrant who died alone, buried without family or friends. Some claimed he'd been a vengeful spirit in life, seeking recognition and vengeance for being ignored. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't help but wonder, was the faceless figure trying to communicate with me, or was it just waiting for the right moment to strike? The whispers, the shadows, the way it had touched that photo, it all pointed to something deeper, some reason why I'd been targeted. As I lay there, watching the door, waiting for the shadow to return, a single thought echoed in my mind, a phrase I hadn't noticed before on my first read-through of the old records: those who ignore the lost shall join them in the dark. I had a sinking feeling that, in its own twisted way, the faceless figure was trying to make sure I remembered that promise. The thought haunted me as I drifted into an uneasy sleep, the echoes of the faceless figure's whisper still reverberating in my ears. And somewhere, in the depths of the dormitory, a door creaked open, as if to welcome me into the darkness I'd been so desperately trying to avoid. It was past midnight, and Wilson Hall was dead silent, save for the occasional creak of the old building settling in the night. I had just finished brushing my teeth, feeling the faint remnants of adrenaline from the night's strange dreams. As I turned to head back to my room, I saw someone standing at the end of the hallway. They were leaning against the wall, half hidden in shadow. At first, I thought they were just another student, a night owl like me, maybe trying to burn off stress from finals. But as I walked closer, something felt wrong. The person looked out of place, like they didn't belong in Wilson Hall or, perhaps, anywhere at all. They were tall, with disheveled hair and a worn jacket that looked several sizes too big. When they saw me, they straightened up, their eyes catching the dim hallway light in a strange, reflective way that sent a chill down my spine. I was about to ask if they were lost when they spoke first, their voice low and unsettlingly familiar. "Back in the day, I used to live here, in Wilson Hall," they said, looking past me as though reminiscing. But things were different then, different and yet the same. Their words hung in the air like smoke, slowly curling and suffocating. I cleared my throat, trying to shake off the cold that had settled over me. "You used to live here?" I repeated, half out of disbelief. Something about this visitor felt too odd, too uncanny, as if they were reaching across some invisible boundary. "Yes," they replied, their gaze shifting to the closed doors lining the hallway. "This place, it holds things, you know? Memories. Spirits. The kind of things that cling to the walls, that can't ever quite let go." They trailed off, their gaze distant, as if they could see something behind the walls that was invisible to me. I tried to gather my nerve, asking, "What kind of things?" "I've heard stories." My words felt clumsy, but I needed answers. After all the strange encounters, the dreams, the noises, and that shadowy figure on my video footage, I was desperate to understand what was going on. Maybe this person could shed some light on it. The visitor turned back to me, a strange gleam in their eyes. "Have you heard about the incident?" they asked, their voice barely a whisper. I blinked, confused. "Incident? A few years back, they continued, there was a student here, quiet, kept to themselves, never drew much attention. No one really knew them. But there was something off, something dark. They took a step closer, and I caught a glimpse of their face under the dim lights. Their eyes seemed shadowed, hollow, like someone who hadn't seen daylight in years. One night, they decided to try something, a ritual, a way to reach beyond. My pulse quickened. What kind of ritual? Something dangerous. I don't know where they found it, but they were convinced it would let them see what others couldn't. Open doors that were meant to stay closed. The visitor's voice was barely a whisper now, and I had to lean in to catch every word. They didn't know. They couldn't have known what they were inviting in. Inviting in? I repeated, a cold sweat forming on the back of my neck. The pieces were starting to come together, but none of it made sense. Every ghost story I'd ever heard in Wilson Hall was about strange noises, things moving, cold drafts, and shadows. Nothing like this. The visitor nodded slowly. It wasn't just a spirit that answered that student. Whatever they called upon, it's darker. Something that can't move on, something that clings to the living, that seeks to replace what it's lost. Their eyes met mine, and I felt as if they were looking straight into my soul. It followed them, stayed close, hidden in the shadows. And when they finally disappeared, it stayed here. I felt the hallway growing colder, a creeping chill spreading through my bones. My mouth went dry. What happened to the student? The visitor's eyes grew darker, more intense. No one knows. They vanished one night. Left all their things behind, but no one ever saw them again. But the sightings began soon after. Shadows where there shouldn't be any, whispers in the night. Students complaining of a feeling like they were being watched. And the dreams about a place where the air feels thick with something wrong. Their words echoed in my mind, too close to what I'd been experiencing myself. The dreams, the sense of something lurking just out of sight, the way the shadows seemed to move on their own. I took a shaky breath, trying to steady myself. You really think it's still here? The visitor's face grew somber, almost pitying. It never left. It's bound to this place, feeding off the energy of anyone who dares to stay here too long. Maybe even trying to take something back. To reclaim what it lost. The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt trapped, like I was standing at the edge of some terrible precipice, staring down into an abyss that I couldn't escape. What do you mean? Reclaim what it lost? The visitor looked over their shoulder, as though expecting something to appear behind them. That's something you'll have to figure out yourself. But whatever you do, don't let it in. Don't let it make you part of its world. Their voice dropped to a hushed, almost fearful whisper. And don't trust the shadows. Not all of them are empty. 1,000 questions flooded my mind, but before I could ask any of them, the visitor stepped back, retreating into the shadows of the hallway. I reached out, desperate to hold on to them, to demand answers, but when I blinked, they were gone. Just gone, as if they had vanished into thin air. I stood there, my heart hammering in my chest, trying to make sense of what had just happened. It felt like I had spoken to a ghost myself, some remnant of the past warning me of dangers I could barely comprehend. My skin prickled as I replayed the conversation in my mind, trying to pick apart every word, every hint. Who was this visitor? And more importantly, what was this thing they mentioned? Something that wasn't quite a ghost, something that didn't just haunt but actively sought out the living, pulling them into its world. The idea was almost too terrifying to comprehend. I stumbled back to my room, locking the door behind me and sitting on the edge of my bed, still reeling. The silence pressed in around me, heavy and watchful, as though Wilson Hall itself was waiting for something. The memory of the visitor's final words echoed in my mind, "Asterisk, don't trust the shadows. Not all of them are empty." Asterisk. That night, I lay in bed with the lights on, watching every corner of the room, every flicker of movement in the shadows. I could feel something lurking just outside my door, waiting, watching, as though it knew I was beginning to understand, as if it was aware that I was inching closer to a truth I wasn't meant to uncover. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it had all been a nightmare, some hallucination brought on by lack of sleep and stress. But the fear lingered, a dark, creeping sensation that followed me everywhere I went. Every time I passed a shadow, I felt an overwhelming urge to look away, to pretend it wasn't there. And every time I tried to sleep, I could feel that faceless presence from my dreams, watching, waiting, like a predator studying its prey. Days passed, each one feeling heavier, more oppressive than the last. I spoke to my friends, hoping to find reassurance, but their faces mirrored my own fear. Each of them had experienced something, a sense of dread, strange dreams, even sightings of shadows in their rooms at night. Wilson Hall wasn't just haunted, it was alive, and whatever resided within its walls was growing stronger, feeding on our fear, our energy, our very souls. I thought about leaving, packing up and finding a different dorm, or even an apartment off campus, but some part of me knew it wouldn't matter. I could feel it now, the way this presence had wound itself around me, binding me to this place. Wilson Hall had claimed me, just as it had claimed that student all those years ago, and I knew that leaving would only delay the inevitable. As I lay in bed that night, listening to the faint creaks of the old building and the whisper of something moving in the shadows, I realized there was only one way to escape Wilson Hall's grip. I had to understand it. I had to uncover whatever dark ritual had unleashed this nightmare, find the remnants of that student's attempt to open doors that were never meant to be opened, and, somehow, find a way to close them. But as I drifted into a restless sleep, the memory of the visitor's final words haunted me, a chilling reminder of the darkness lurking in the corners of Wilson Hall. Asterisk, not all shadows are empty. Asterisk. The realization hit me like a thunderclap. The shadows, the scratches on the walls, the chilling warnings, they were not the work of a tormented student spirit. No, this presence was something far older, far more malicious, drawn out of the soil beneath Wilson Hall. It made a twisted kind of sense. The rumors, the strange history buried under layers of campus lore, the disquiet that had haunted Wilson Hall since the beginning. I had assumed the haunting was tied to the botched ritual of that long-ago student, a lost soul tethered to this place through some accident of magic. But the truth, now dawning on me, was far worse. That student had only been a conduit, an unknowing catalyst. They had tried to summon something, and instead, they had awakened something that had been waiting beneath the foundations of Wilson Hall for decades, maybe even centuries. My heart pounded as I scrambled through the notes I had gathered, the stories, the fragments of campus myth and forgotten lore. Each piece now fit together with horrifying clarity. The haunted dorm was no mere legend. This ancient spirit, this dark entity, was never meant to be bound to a single place. The disturbed graves, the desecration of the old cemetery, the ritual that had torn a hole between worlds, it had unleashed something bound by neither time nor space, something that had waited in silence, buried beneath the soil. I had to leave. I gathered my things in a frantic rush, my hands shaking, and headed for the door. But as I reached for the handle, I felt a chill seep into the air, a cold so deep it felt like it was crawling into my bones. The door wouldn't budge. I pulled again, throwing my weight against it, but it was as if the wood had fused to the frame. I tried the window next, but it wouldn't open, the glass sealed tight as if by some unseen force. The silence around me deepened. It was the kind of silence that's thick with menace, the kind that settles like a fog, blocking out everything else. And then, a voice, low and guttural, filled the air. Asterisk, you disturbed my rest. You think you can leave? Asterisk. My heart stopped. The voice wasn't coming from outside the door, or even the hallway. It was inside the room with me, hovering in the air, seething with malice. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the shadows, but there was nothing there, only the sound of my own shaky breaths and the racing of my heart. But then, slowly, the shadows began to gather in one corner of the room, coalescing, solidifying into a twisted form that loomed over me. It was no longer the figure of a faceless ghost. This was something more monstrous, its shape almost human but not quite, like it had tried to take a human form but hadn't quite managed to get it right. Hollow eyes stared back at me, voids that seemed to pull in all the light around them, and its mouth was stretched wide in a twisted, knowing smile. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. My throat felt tight, my voice trapped, as if it had stolen the very air from my lungs. You called me here, it whispered, the words thick and dripping with hatred. Asterisk, I have waited. I have watched. And now, you will stay with me, forever. Asterisk. The words sent a wave of cold through me, a primal terror that told me I was in the presence of something that defied reason, something that thrived on fear and despair. I backed away, but the room seemed to shift around me, stretching, twisting. The walls themselves seemed to pulse with a dark energy, the words your next scrawled on them shifting, bleeding down in dark, viscous streams. My head was spinning, the air thickening as though something was suffocating me. I realized then that the room itself was part of the entity, a prison it had created, bending reality to trap me within its grasp. But I couldn't just give up. I wasn't going to let this thing consume me without a fight. My mind raced, scrambling for anything that could help me, any shred of hope. The ritual. I remembered the final line, a part of the invocation that supposedly closed the door between worlds. If I could just get through it, maybe I could seal this thing away, trap it back where it belonged. Clutching the scrap of paper with the ritual words, I started to recite, my voice shaking but growing louder as I forced myself through the phrases, feeling the air crackle around me. The shadow figure recoiled, its form flickering, twisting in agony. The room itself seemed to resist, like the walls were pressing in, fighting against my words. But just as I reached the final line, the entity lunged, a shriek filling the air, deafening and primal. It wrapped around me, cold tendrils winding up my arms, my legs, squeezing until I could barely move. My vision blurred, the words slipping from my mind as the world tilted, faded. I was losing. Its presence was overpowering, pressing into my mind, filling it with darkness, images of twisted graves, restless spirits clawing at the earth, all bound by this ancient malevolence. I could feel it trying to consume me, dragging me into the shadows, into the void where it lurked. But somewhere, deep within me, a surge of defiance rose. I remembered the visitor's warning, the reminder that it was never just a ghost. It was a spirit bound by human actions, by mistakes, by unfinished business. And if I could tap into that, if I could reach beyond its hatred, its hunger, maybe I could find a way to sever its hold. With a final burst of strength, I forced the last words out of my mouth, pushing through the darkness, pouring every ounce of my will into the closing line of the ritual. Asterisk, return to your rest. Be gone from this place. Asterisk. There was a moment of stillness, a silence so profound it felt like the world had frozen. Then, a scream tore through the air, raw and unearthly, filling every corner of the room, every crevice of Wilson Hall. The figure before me began to shatter, splintering into fragments of darkness that felt like ash, dissolving as they touched the floor. The chill in the room lifted, and I collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. The silence was back, heavy and oppressive, but this time it was a silence of peace. Whatever had been lurking here, it was gone. I stumbled to the door, reaching out with a trembling hand. The knob turned easily now, as though whatever force had held it shut was finally gone. I pulled it open and stepped into the hallway, feeling like I'd walked through a nightmare. I could see other students peeking out of their rooms, their faces pale, eyes wide with the same disbelief and terror that I felt. But as I walked down the hall, heading for the exit, something stopped me in my tracks. The hallway felt different. Longer. I looked back, and for just a moment, I thought I saw something move at the end of the corridor, a shadow slipping around a corner, silent and watching. I shook my head, telling myself it was just nerves. The ritual had worked. The entity was gone. I was free. But as I reached the doors of Wilson Hall and pushed them open, a sense of unease lingered in the pit of my stomach. The building was quiet now, its shadows still, but it felt like it was waiting, watching. I stepped outside, breathing in the cool night air, trying to shake off the feeling that clung to me. But as I walked across campus, glancing back at the dark silhouette of Wilson Hall, a cold shiver ran down my spine. In the days that followed, strange things continued to happen in Wilson Hall. Students whispered about doors still slamming, shadows moving in the corners of their eyes, that same sense of being watched. And though I was far away, no longer bound to that cursed building, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd left a piece of myself behind. Sometimes, late at night, I would hear footsteps in my own hallway, a faint, dragging sound that felt all too familiar. And every time I looked back, I was certain I would see that shadowy figure, waiting. But I never did. Not really. Or maybe, it was always there, lurking in the darkness, just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to return.